Okay, chapter 18 is the last chapter in the book, talking about global politics. And this is a pretty big topic. There's quite a bit of stuff in that last chapter. So, what I'm going to do is try to condense this as best I can into what I think is the most useful or most interesting information for you to know. So, let's take a little bit of a review here on the state. We've talked about this before. The state is the central unit and decision maker in our global system, which is still considered anarchic in that there's no global governments, there's no global governance. So all the states are sovereign, where each state is autonomous and there's no higher authority of the state. Now, as we'll see in these competing views of how the world works, states do cooperate and they are delegating things out to organizations, but they're also still competitive and they are still driven by their own power. So we'll talk about those competing theories here in a minute. Let's back up and talk a little bit about the history of this modern era of global politics. The modern era that we're in right now has its roots in the aftermath of World War II. The winners of the World War II in 1945, particularly we're talking about the United States, France, Britain, Russia, or the former USSR, and China, pretty much got together, and you could certainly argue that the United States and Britain had the most to do with this, creating a modern global system that was based on democracy and capitalism. They created at that period the organizations that we still see in the world today, the primary international organizations in the world today, particularly United Nations, which we could talk quite a bit about. It is the perhaps most prevalent international organization out there in the world. It's got numerous arms and bodies that are looking at various different aspects, whether all the way from development of poor countries to human rights. They also, at the end of World War II, came together and created what is now the World Trade Organization, which is the referee and the monitor over our trading system to try to keep it as balanced and fair as possible. They also created the International Monetary Fund, which also regulates the monetary systems of the world, the currencies, also development loans, things like that. They also created the forerunner to the World Bank, which is one of the most prominent organizations in the world as far as helping poor states develop their economies, their infrastructures, things like that. So the system that they created is still in place and still evolving in some ways and still having to deal with the other competing views as far as how to develop your economies or to run your governments. Now, the Cold War was initiated also around this time. The Cold War is kind of more of a term for an ideological conflict, particularly between the United States and the Soviet Union. And immediately after the World War II, our mistrust of the communist system pretty much kicked right back into place, even though we were allies during World War II and probably could not have won the war without each other's help. Nevertheless, we were suspicious of communism well before that. And so we fell into the bipolar world. And you could certainly argue that by 1949, when the Soviet Union developed their atomic bomb, yes, then this bipolar system, the Cold War, started to build. Bipolar simply meaning that we have two global powers that are pretty much calling the shots, and everything else kind of revolves around them. So the argument at that time was autocratic communism versus democratic capitalism. A lot of mistrust, miscommunication. talk about how it fell in just a minute. But we started to see the buildup of the arms race, the missile race, the space race, a lot of competition and military buildup was revolving around this Cold War. In several wars, what we would call proxy wars, that flared up as a result of the ideological Cold War, most prominently the Korean War, which had 3 years of conflict and really nothing was resolved, lots of deaths, and the Vietnam War, kind of the same thing, several years, 58,000 U.S. casualties, and then we eventually left, and not much of anything was accomplished from that. So there's a lot of counterproductive things going on during this Cold War. Fall of the Soviet Union really started to happen in earnest in 1989, but before that, the leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, had been reaching out because their economy was failing, their government was not effective, and so when the Soviet Union fell, that was kind of a pretty landmark moment. For one, it pretty much confirmed the United States as the sole superpower of the world. So we've been in a unipolar world ever since that time, where the United States is considered the sole hegemon, and this means superpower. And even though that's certainly true, particularly in terms of our military and our presence around the world, you could certainly argue that economically we are starting to see some rivals as far as China in particular, perhaps the EU if the EU remains intact, but still considerably a unipolar world because of the strength the United States have and the potential that the United States could use it. And also another very important aspect of this fall of the Soviet Union also meant the fall of communism, and it was considered somewhat of a victory for capitalism, and that really spawned the globalization era that we'll talk about here in a minute, that is created quite a bit of controversy because capitalism has survived because it's fairly adaptable and has created a lot of wealth and success for a certain amount of people, but it's also created a backlash of things that we'll talk about here in a minute. So let's talk about three basic ideas or theories of how the world works with respect to international relations. The first theory revolves around the state being the main actor and the state's use or striving for power. So under the theory of realism, it pretty much takes the view that the world is clearly anarchic. There's no global governance, and there's not likely ever to be a global governance. So therefore, the state is and will be the primary actor. But there's no argument about that, whichever theory that you look at. But the realist theory looks at the state as being primarily self-interested in its own national interest, and it's competitive in its strive for power and economic wealth. And then particularly under the realist theory, stability occurs through this use of power, through this striving for power, and most importantly, it occurs in this very unequal system. It occurs from a balance of power, and that balance of power could actually mean the balance between the sole hegemon, such as the United States, and the rest of the world. That's technically the balance that we're talking about right now, is the United States versus everyone else. And during the Cold War, that balance of power was the Soviet Union and the United States. And even though it was very tenuous time, a lot of mistrust, several wars, conflicts broke up or came up as a result, there was a balance of power, and they at least did maintain their existence by not destroying each other because of that balance of power. Now, the theory of institutionalism takes it a little bit farther. It's still acknowledges that the state is the sole actor, but institutionalism is based on this interdependence between states, and the fact that there are mutual benefits of cooperation that the states acknowledge and the states actively engage in. So the clearly, when you look at realism and institutionalism, both of them are happening at various times. But as far as a pure theory, a realist, of course, would look at it the other way. The institutionalists will look at it that this is the prevalent view of what's happening. Under the institutionalist view, states have diverse interests, and they are willing to delegate functions to the international organizations, which we'll touch on here in a minute. Now, the main difference here is that the institutionalist theory, states are delegating to the international organizations to serve global interests and provide public goods, whereas from the realist view, the international organizations are created by the states and are considered like arms of the powerful states, and the states are using them to serve their own specific particular interests. So there's a little of both of that going on. It's just a variation of how it's defined. Also, under the institutionalist view, the non-governmental organizations are increasingly serving a useful purpose. They span borders. They try to tackle issues that weak states or poor states cannot resolve, or the fact that rich and powerful states are just not interested in trying to solve those problems into areas that are geopolitically insignificant to that large state. So the NGOs are private organizations, typically nonprofit, that rely on grants and funds and aid and volunteer contributions in order to try to solve some of these problems, whether it's hunger, poverty, refugee crises, human rights, women's rights, environmental issues, things like that. They try to solve them at the ground roots level directly. So those are some of the main factors and actors of institutionalism. Now, another way of looking at our global system is what has been increasingly considered over the past 3 decades at least, or 2.5 decades, particularly since the end of the Cold War, fall of the Soviet Union, is this concept of globalization. Now, as a broad general term, globalization is referring to the integration of all of these things, whether it's economies, telecommunications, transportation, even cultural aspects of entertainment and art that are just literally crossing or amalgamating or merging across national borders. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of this system, because there is somewhat of a backlash against it that's occurring right now that was perhaps partly responsible for electing a new president that was had a somewhat anti-globalist tone to him. Now, another interesting thing about globalization is that even though from this definition we're using the word integration, and that perhaps globalization is trying to help or assist this merging of a world society. Well, that would probably be more relevant under an institutionalist view, as states come together and literally agree on their institutions and have institutions of law, institutions of markets that they all are using. Whereas globalization, however, it may actually be countering that somewhat by reinforcing sovereignty, because globalization is focusing on the economic benefits of a country. So the country is using globalization to reinforce their sovereignty rather than erode it. At least that's what we may be seeing. However, this is the paradox. Simultaneously, states are becoming even more economically interdependent. So what we're seeing perhaps is a two-tiered type of system, to where states are fiercely maintaining their sovereignty so that they can control their own borders, but at the same time are becoming, in some cases, maybe even hopelessly dependent or interdependent on other states for their economy. So it could be a very interesting evolution here. Now, globalization, and one of the reasons why it has been getting some negative kickback, is that it's typically associated with global capitalism. Even though globalization is referring to all of these things, what is typically focused on is the capitalist aspects of it. So what I would like you to do is run back to chapter 5 real quick and review the aspects of capitalism, what it means, what capital means, and particularly some of the concerns with capitalism per se, as it promotes boom and bust cycles and promotes inequality and promotes, or at least facilitates, monopolistic behavior. Well, if that's what capitalism does within a country, well, that's what it's doing globally as well as bringing some states more prosperity and wealth. It also is bringing some of these other uh, negatives to it as well. The primary positives of globalization is that, as I said, that capitalism has survived primarily because it's been adaptable and flexible enough to create wealth, and particularly if people are plugged into it, and know how to use it, and maybe even have more advantages than other people to use it. That's part of the concern, but it has generated relatively a lot of prosperity. It has also become somewhat of a package deal with democracy, and that also we could be seeing a little bit of a backlash on democracy as well. We talked about that before. The interdependence as well, and this amalgamation, good, bad, right, or wrong, has really nothing to do with it. If people are coming together in understanding, even in their entertainment, cultural tastes, things like that, what we start to see is generally less conflict, because human beings, are interacting, and regardless of the system that they're using, this is causing them to interact, and the increased awareness and understanding and interaction has shown less conflict globally. Okay. However, there are some serious concerns with globalization, and that's part of why politically we start to see kind of a seesaw back and forth between leaders and administrations that are more pro-globalization or perhaps less pro-globalization. The biggest concerns, of course, particularly within the economy, and particularly within the U.S. economy, is that it is the multinational corporations have been taking advantage of it to outsource and find cheaper labor. Now, while that provides cheaper products for our consumers, it does, however, push industrialization and manufacturing off into the cheaper countries, and so therefore there's less jobs and less high-paying, stable industrial type jobs for the domestic workforce. So that's been one of the biggest concerns with globalization. We also know, as a function of capitalism, these benefits are not distributed equally. As globalization continues, we do see the divide between rich states and poor states is growing, perhaps not as fast as a rate, because the globalization has made the poor states better off. Not enough, you could argue, certainly not enough in most cases, but relatively speaking, poor states have seen some benefits from this, but just because of the fact that capitalism is conducive to inequality, well, we're starting to see that as well within the states and between states. Now, one of the biggest concerns, particularly among the poor states in this globalization of our economy, is that in order for them to get plugged in to this global capital system, they have to reform, they have to change their economies, which may not be conducive to their society or to their population or their culture. Whereas it worked for Britain back in the Industrial Revolution, back in the 1800s, 1700s, well, poor states today don't have those same abilities or advantages, but they're still pressured to open up their economies. This particularly means to not protect their industries, to engage in trade, to not socialize their economies or their industrial factors, and to privatize those to get into the free market. So this is what we call the neoliberalist view of the global economy, is that even the poor states have to conform to how the rich states are doing it. And unfortunately, the poor states lack the economic base to compete on that level. They still have a lot of development to do. We could talk literally, as I mentioned earlier, we're condensing a lot of stuff into one lecture here, but we could talk weeks about how the poor states are still politically unstable or do not have a developed infrastructure or a human infrastructure as far as educated workforce. They just don't have those things, and it takes a long time to get those. And in some cases, particularly if you stay politically unstable, you'll never get over that hump in order to get plugged in to this global capitalist system in order to develop and seriously improve your condition. And of course, another big concern about the globalization is the multinational corporations are using this global system for their power and leverage. They can bargain between states in order to avoid paying taxes or to have fewer regulations. So the multinational corporations are gaining in power in this global system because there are no global regulations on corporate activity. All those regulations are within a country. So if a multinational corporation doesn't like that U.S. is charging them this much tax or forcing them to comply with these regulations, well, a multinational can say, well, we'll take our headquarters elsewhere. We'll still sell you our bright shiny gadgets that you really love to buy, but we are also going to put our base into another country and pay fewer taxes to you, and perhaps not have to worry so much about labor laws or environmental regulations or things like that. So that's one of the other concerns about globalization, is the gaining power of the multinational corporations, which obviously provide a lot of benefit to the world as far as putting people to work and providing products, but we also have to look at all sides of these equations here. Now, international law, I'm only going to be able to touch on this. The international law suffers the same problem globally, is what we've kind of been hitting on here, is that there's no global Supreme Court. There's no global president with a international police force that can enforce international law. So this absence of central global legal authority means that all the states are kind of working on this together or individually or what we would call reciprocally in order to try to come up with ways of cooperating and then legally defining their activities and then trying to figure out who's going to enforce it or how it's going to be enforced. And from that point alone, you could say that our international system law is still relatively primitive and still evolving. And the two primary examples of global courts are the United Nations International Court of Justice, which we'll show you a map here in a minute, but the ICJ is still relatively weak and ineffective on the global scale because, again, it has extreme difficulty enforcing their decisions. What happens to happen is that the states have to agree to abide by the ICJ's decision. And so therefore, when two states come together and says, okay, we cannot resolve this issue, we will take it to you, ICJ, and we will agree to abide by your decision. And that takes a lot of work for states to get to that point because jurisdiction and compliance is voluntary. States, because they're sovereign, do not necessarily have to go to this court or agree to its jurisdiction. And so therefore, the states are typically bringing relatively minor issues to this court. We see border disputes perhaps between states where it's certainly not about to cause a war, because otherwise courts would be kind of powerless if the two states wanted to go to war anyway. or they may be haggling over some economic issues or perhaps some interpretation of some uh, international uh, interaction. Uh, for example, last year Australia had brought a dispute against Japan because of their whaling operation. Japan had been justifying their whaling operation for research. The Australians said that they thought that was not what Japan was really doing. It went to the ICJ, and the ICJ actually ruled against Japan to curtail their whaling operation under the guise of research. And for example, Argentina and Chile had a long-standing border dispute, as you can imagine, as long as their border is, and they took that to the ICJ as well. The other type of court is relatively new. It came into effect in 2003, and that's the International Criminal Court, which was inspired particularly in the post-Cold War conflicts of Bosnia, the Bosnian War, which was a lot of civilians were killed and rendered homeless because of ethnic cleansing and genocide. There was another just incredibly devastating, uh, I guess you could say, conflict in Rwanda where 800,000 men, women, and children were literally butchered in just a couple of months because of ethnic conflict. And so the International Criminal Court came together to try to pursue not necessarily states. They're trying to go after the individuals who are the perpetrators of these crimes, whether it's genocide, wars of aggression, war crimes. Now, of course, wars of aggression is still kind of on the table as far as pursuing that. Now, again, the International Criminal Court, uh, whereas it does have a little bit more power to reach out and go after people and prosecute them, it is still a very primitive and an evolving process of trying to bring people to justice. And in many cases, they cannot. They have to even indict them in absentia because they can't get them. For example, the president of Sudan has been indicted for years, but he will never put himself in a position where he could actually get arrested and brought to The Hague and then put on trial. There have been a few that have been brought to trial and been convicted of these various crimes. But again, it's a very still in the infant stages as far as, and we're also seeing that some states in Africa have withdrawn from the International Court, and Russia is threatening to withdraw as well. So the validity and the credibility of these courts is still in danger because of states may not want to comply with it. Here's the map showing the International Court of Justice participation. As you can see, the bulk of the world has not even submitted to ICJ declaration. They have not agreed to voluntary compliance. And before you look at the rest of the world and go tisk, 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 well, look, the United States actually has withdrawn from their voluntary compulsion, the only state that's actually withdrawn from it. And that arose out of a dispute with the ICJ, particularly, well, it started back in the 80s with a dispute over treatment of Mexicans accused of a crime, and then we withdrew even further after the 9/11 attacks as part of our pretty much of a unilateral approach on fighting terrorism. The United States did not want to have any international courts holding us back or hampering us in our pursuits of trying to take care of this war on terrorism, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But again, the United States has not even agreed to work with the International Criminal Court as well. So that shows you that one of the problems with international law is that even the powerful states are not necessarily crazy about having their power under the jurisdiction of some global court. So that shows you how the sovereignty still reigns, particularly if you're a powerful state like the United States. All right, so let's just talk a few minutes of the basic instruments of global politics. Diplomacy is the first line of dealing with other countries. And unfortunately, even though it's constantly working behind the scenes, the public perception of that is a general distrust of diplomacy, and that goes all the way back to Chamberlain's agreement with Hitler, who Hitler then quickly broke that. So the concept of appeasement has had a kind of a nasty connotation ever since. People don't trust it. And so therefore, diplomacy is always vulnerable to politics. Politicians can use whatever a current president is doing. They can always badmouth it and find negatives about it because the general public's perception of diplomacy is not all that great. Uh, for example, if we have to deal with Syria and the Assad remains in power, he's a dictator that we did not really want there in the first place. We were supporting the democratic rebels, but if Assad is the victor and we want to have an agreement, well, guess what? We have to deal with the guy in charge. And we have, if all we can do is just make some incremental patchwork agreement to prevent people from getting killed, well, then that's what we may have to do with a dictator. And then potentially what could happen 3 weeks later, a military coup could assassinate that dictator and we got a new regime in place, and so therefore that agreement is totally out the window. And so therefore that gives the public not a whole lot of faith in diplomacy. But however, it is literally the main first line of communication between states. It's ongoing, it's incremental. They are constantly gathering information to see what this country's doing. Can we trust them? Are they our allies? Should we be suspicious? There's just non-stop information gathering going on in our diplomatic systems. Now, before states decide to go to war, economic sanctions are typically the first go-to, I guess you could say, punishment, and they are reasonably effective if certain things are in place. And so if a state is doing something or misbehaving, doing something that the consensus or the majority of their states feel like is not a good thing to do, well, then the other states can come together and agree to put sanctions on that country, which would mean we're not going to give you oil, we're not going to buy your products, we're going to put bans on certain activities, we're going to potentially freeze assets. In fact, the Obama administration used that somewhat effectively against actors such as Venezuela and Russia and Iran in order to get them to, particularly Iran, and in order to get them to agree to a ban on their nuclear program, and clearly trying to prevent North Korea from getting nuclear weapons. These are activities that states typically come together in order to try to maximize the effect on that country to get them to change their behavior. And so therefore, sanctions and such are more effective if all the parties are participating. Because if some major players aren't participating, then the sanction would lose its effectiveness. For example, if China did not want to participate in the sanction on Iran because they need their oil from Iran, well, then that would still give Iran an out to sell oil, or perhaps even sell oil to other parties and make up for their losses. So therefore, they're not as hit as hard, and sanction is not as effective. And so another potential problem with sanctions is that if they are lasting, they could be devastating to civil society. The sanctions on Iraq that began in the early 90s to prevent Saddam Hussein from militarizing further or to trying to pursue nuclear weapons. Well, we see that of the society of Iraq, the child mortality and longevity of their society plummeted in over that decade. And Saddam Hussein was still living quite lavishly, and we ended up going to war against them anyway. So again, economic sanctions are not always effective. Things have to be in place for them to work, but when they work, they potentially prevent a war and could provide incentives for states to change behavior that most everybody else disagrees with, whether it's aggressive behavior or threatening behavior or pursuing programs that we've long ago agreed not to pursue, such as nuclear weapons. Now, war or military force is certainly something that most people would agree that we would like to avoid, but again, because we're human beings and we're driven by our passions and driven by our emotions, it's probably just a matter of time before we can get whipped up into going to war again. That's just kind of how we are. One of the fact that we were in 2 wars over that last decade, we still have somewhat of a reluctance to get into war, which is certainly a campaign issue that affected the election because of what's being done in the Middle East or what could be done in the Middle East. The concept of a just war is probably the only thing that people could agree on as far as going to war, and that is that war is the last resort. Everything has been tried, and that there's a legitimate authority that has decided to go to war. It could be for the purposes of self-defense or some sense of justice, and of course the ultimate goal is to bring peace. You could certainly argue that World War II was a just war, particularly from our point of view, considering how we were brought into it and what we were fighting against, and the consequences of what could have been if we had not prevailed. And Mike could certainly argue that the Gulf War was somewhat of a just war in that trying to prevent the invasion of another relatively defenseless country. Most other wars, certainly difficult to make that just war argument. And of course, one of the biggest problems that we have to deal with is that most conflicts, almost 90% of all the wars in the world for last many decades, have been within states. And so that's an internal problem that a lot of superpowers kind of have to sit around and say, well, what's happening? Are you going to take care of your problems? Should we get involved? Very tough decision. It's just as what we could see is happening in Syria. We may provide help. We may support democracy, things like that. But if it's an internal issue, then there's lots of other factors involved as to how or why we might get involved in it. Now, one of the growing concerns with getting involved in any kind of conflict is that, is it in the national interest or is it for humanitarian reasons? And national interest, of course, could be considered perhaps pursuing your own interests at the peril of others, which would not be considered just, you could argue. And then, of course, the humanitarian reasons for war could perhaps be more justified because innocent people are getting killed or becoming homeless or becoming refugees. And so, therefore, at some point, such as the war in Syria, would a superpower consider getting involved just for the simple reason of stopping the war and maintaining some sort of order and control to prevent further death? That's a very difficult decision to make. Particularly, Russia has entered into that war and allied with Syria, which makes it even more complicated for if the United States was to get involved. We'd have perhaps a kind of a somewhat of a Cold War Part 2 situation, perhaps building up there. Not likely, but again, major considerations that you have to deal with here in getting involved in any conflict. Now, the concept of preemptive war is where a state is reasonably afraid of attack, or maybe it's predicting that it's going to get attacked, so therefore it attacks first. Now, Israel has done this a few times because they live in the middle of a region that is very hostile to them. 1967 Six Days War, they preemptively attacked because they sensed the buildup on their borders, and they struck first and prevailed. And of course, they have also been accused of responding misappropriately to the threat because of their military power, particularly as a fairly strong ally of the United States. And so that's one of the drawbacks of a preemptive war, is that, are you sure you're going to be attacked? Well, it's hard to predict the future. And are you responding appropriate to the threat? Probably not, because you want to make sure that the threat is vanquished. Now, the Iraq War was considered to be a preemptive war, in that the Bush administration felt like that Saddam Hussein was pursuing nuclear, or at least weapons of mass destruction. And obviously the aftermath of 9/11 was certainly used to help facilitate or sell that war, and it was discredited because of the problems that were experienced with the Iraq War. So this concept of a preemptive war has really lost a lot of its luster because of the Iraq War, and unlikely to be pursued in the near future. Now, terrorism, of course, is one of our main preoccupations, particularly since 9/11. And terrorism has some very specific characteristics. Terrorism is targeting civilians for political purposes, and not obeying any form of state behavior. States, in order to be considered states in this sovereign system of our world, have to comply with certain norms of behavior in order to be considered a state. And there's certain things that a state could not do, otherwise it could lose its credibility and have all these other forces act upon it, as the ones we've been talking about. But terrorist groups are clearly defined terrorism as such because they are clandestine, secretive, targeting civilians, breaking laws, and it's all an attempt to influence the politics of their situation. Again, their justifications, or I guess you could say their reasons for being terrorists, would certainly be valid, but of course that does not justify the tactics that are using. But what is most effective about terrorism is that they are creating fear and creating emotional responses, and perhaps even more effectively, creating economic responses to their threat. And that provides, even though they may never prevail, that's providing some sense of success or victory for them just by creating fear amongst the superpower, or enormous amount of expense in order to deal with them. So that's certainly a motivation, whether they would win anything or not. It's also a fairly cost-effective type of system, and which is one of the reasons why people that are inclined to be terrorists, which we could talk a lot more about, but the fact that it's cost-effective is another thing that is attractive to those actors, in that when you look at, for example, 9/11, less than 100 people were literally involved in Al-Qaeda at that time. Only a handful of people were aware of the planning, and only 19 perpetrators pulled it off. And it was an enormous amount of destruction that literally changed the world that we live in. So that shows you how cost-effective a terrorist act can be, and why it's pursued by so many disaffected people. And again, one of the primary aspects of terrorism is its use of violence and targeting innocent civilians. So however noble your ends are, do not justify the violent means, and that's why there is a clear, predominant global norm that terrorism is not the route to go. And so that's probably the thing that, regardless of how ineffective a state may be, or perhaps even have some sympathy for the religious group that is behind this particular terror cell, still the counterproductivity of terrorism, there's a pretty global norm as far as trying to prevent that. The State Department lists approximately 60 terrorist organizations that are recognized in the world. There's the website there, and just show you that real quick. This is just a small slice of it. You see in 2013, Boko Haram, which is very prominent in Nigeria, was put on the list. And as you can see, just in the last few years, there have been several factions of ISIL, or what is also referred to as ISIS, in the Middle East, have also been added to the list of recognized terrorist groups. Now, terrorism has what we certainly would call mixed success, because while they have succeeded in killing innocent civilians to get attention of the world and drawn, clearly an enormous amount of attention and expense on trying to deal with them, you certainly might argue that they are in a losing battle in the long run because of their the fact that the global consensus is against them, the lack of resources, the fact that they're not necessarily effective at creating any type of credible governance, and so people would eventually fall away from that. And so what we've seen is that terrorism typically subsides with the political legitimacy of their organization. Of course, that is very difficult. If a terrorist group decides that, okay, let's go and start changing, and instead of being a terrorist group, we want to become a political party. And as you can see how, even though that literally could solve the problem, that is also very difficult to do, because if that terrorist group has killed people, that's going to be very difficult and certainly a very long time before anybody would sympathize with them as a political organization or a political party. So that's this is why it's so difficult. You might not be able to kill every terrorist on the planet, because for every one you kill, you might recruit 2 more as a result. But as people become aware, become educated, become a little bit more, I guess you could say, agreeable to the idea of diplomacy and cooperation and interdependence, and then start to come out of the terrorism into a political legitimate group, that would certainly be a long-term solution to it. But again, long-term is the key, plus the fact that a lot of people may never actually forgive them for what they had done. So this is why it's a very complicated topic. And the United States war on terrorism since 9/11, the amount of expense has been astronomical to fight the war on terror. We have certainly prevented terrorist attacks, but you certainly can't prevent all of them, particularly domestic or lone wolf type terrorists that would slip through the cracks. The intelligence budget has tripled at least since then, and of course the issue of surveillance has become a very controversial issue, in that we gave the United States considerable amount of power to surveil the population in order to prevent terrorism, but then of course it backlashes into an invasion of privacy. So again, very complicated issues that we could spend weeks talking about. One final thing, let's talk about the democratic peace theory, which is a fairly interesting theory in that it's still held up. That came into prominence during the 1990s when political scientists started to study way back into the late 1700s, 1800s, as to when states started to become democratic. The United States perhaps could be considered the first of the modern era when we wrote our Constitution. But what they found out is that democracies have not gone to war with each other. It is still held up. You can go back and look at all the conflicts in the world over the past 200 years, and at the time, the states that had gone to war with each other, there was never a case where both of them were democracies. And so that has perhaps led to a push towards democracy, which also could have negative backlashes as well. But and we actually have seen kind of a stagnation of democracy as a result. But The fact that democracies have domestic constraints, the leaders are held more accountable. The tax dollars that are spent on war are more scrutinized. Leaders have to get elected. Leaders, if they're not even going to engage in a war unless they know they're going to win it, of course, that's turned out disastrously for a few leaders. So there are several factors that would constrain a democracy from getting into a war. And so, particularly if both sides have those constraints, we see that they are not likely to go to war to each other. However, we do see that democracies such as the United States do go to war with non-democracies. That's the trade-off of this theory, is that the United States has been at war with more than anybody else with non-democracies. And but that you could perhaps argue is that's one of the reasons why the United States and a lot of the Western world would pursue democracies in other countries or try to facilitate or help. That's why you could certainly argue why we would be supporting the democratic rebels in Syria, because if we could get a democracy growing there, long run might be less risk of conflict there, just as we would hope that there might be less risk of conflict in Iraq or Afghanistan because of trying to develop democracies there. Again, lots of debate as to how well those democracies have been established or what their chances of survival are. Lots of questions still remain as some of these fledgling democracies. But clearly, a democracy would probably be certainly more willing to promote more democracies because of the common elements here, regardless of the democratic peace theory. Those are the basic things that we've just talked about that you want to review on. Take some good notes, memorize a few bullet points, make sure you're clear on the understanding of these basic topics here. And also what I want to do is go back. There's a couple of things that I want to touch on for this last test. Review Locke's concept of liberalism in Chapter 2. And another thing that I wanted to cover is that let's review what the factors are that lead to the expansion of governments in Chapter 4. So review those as well.